I just wanted to start by asking all three of you whether, looking into the future and the crystal ball gazing we've been doing today, is the answer to continue in many ways doing what we've already been doing, but better and greener and so on, or is it more a case of ripping up the rule book and doing things in an entirely different way as we move forward? Michele, I'll start with you.
We keep on looking to see if we can do things in a different way. Certainly from a transport point of view, can we disperse the activity? Can we have more activity in the areas outside of central London? Can we have more activity in the areas beyond central London so that the demands on the transport system aren't as great? Can more people live and work in their immediate locality, cycle to the local shops, etc., etc.? But it's this strong dominance on the London economy of central London that draws people in. So we either support it or we fight it or ignore it. And the economic advice is if we ignore it, it'll go elsewhere. Do we want that for not just the London economy, but for the UK economy, since it's such a sort of like a large exporter of tax in the first place to the rest of the UK?
David, with housing, I mean, people have often said through the day, oh, the new form of housing is going to be something that you couldn't even imagine, and then it often seems to be sort of the same old housing.
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I remember in London in the late 80s, early 90s, one of the big debates was when are people going to start building flats again? Because all people wanted was sort of low-rise houses, and now I think something like 95% of all new homes built in London are flats. So I think things do change. One of the big changes in London in my lifetime has been, well, two things which I think are very relevant. One, culturally it's very different and it's much more diverse, and people, I think, by and large, are more familiar and more settled living in a more metropolitan, dense environment. That's a good thing. The other thing I think that's really changed is that in many ways, inner London, which was seen as the sort of centre of most of London's problems a generation ago, is increasingly being seen as wealthy and prosperous, not without its difficulties, I grant you, but nevertheless quite prosperous in many respects. And many parts of outer London, it seems to me, have actually, which were a generation ago seen as very prosperous and successful, are struggling. So I think part of the answer about what happens next is more focus on outer London and getting our town centres working differently.
Basil, blue sky thinking in your area.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we predict that by 2050, electricity demand will double because of some of the things I talked about, the electrification of transport and so on and so forth. If we keep on doing what we've done in the past, in simple terms, we would have to double the capacity of the network. Clearly, that's going to be, one, expensive and two, disruptive. So smart grids, which I mentioned briefly before, which enable, and the rolling out of smart meters, which is due to start early 16, where all of us will, for the first time, will get some control on our energy usage. Will facilitate to move the transition to smart grids, where the demand, if you take electric vehicles, the demand is not just going to increase between 7 when we all get home and 9 at night, or first thing in the morning, but the load is spread overnight, for example, so that the capacity of the network, or the network generally, is better utilised rather than you have peaks. So, but to do that, the network needs to be developed in a way that we actually have got remote control, which at this stage we haven't.
Right, I'm going to open things up to the floor. Let me know if you want to ask a question. I think if we could get a microphone to Stanley Johnson.
Yeah, yes, thanks very much. I've got to declare an interest here. I'm the father of the mayor, but I not discuss it with him. In 1969, when I was working for the Conservative Research Department, something called Conservative Central Office published a report I wrote called An Optimum Population Policy for Britain, or something like that. You can still get it on Amazon. Now here's my question. Is anybody, either in City Hall or more generally, actually saying to themselves, well, why do we need to have a London of 10 million, 10.5 million, 11 million? Shouldn't we be thinking of policies to limit the growth of London and stop doing possibly stupid things like London-centric investments? I obviously cite HS2, which is going to bring more and more people into London. Why not, develop the north? I just listened to you. Of course, I'm terribly impressed by the optimism with which Michele was speaking. But I say to myself, why is it that planners always assume they have to meet demand rather than think, how can you reduce demand? Thank you.
So can we turn the tide of this ever-increasing population?
I'd say that we are looking at that question. I'm sorry that it's not clear. We're looking at the question in the sense that London's growing, and we try and house that growth in London, or we assume that growth goes elsewhere. So either the population is housed within London to support the jobs that we want to come to London, or you assume that you build those houses sort of outside of London. You can build them sort of like, further away, whether it's sort of 50 miles away or whatever. But it's the linkage between the population and the employment that's coming. And we want to support the employment that's coming, and it's the sort of employment that's coming to London that then adds to the wealth of the UK. So we want the people here to be able to do the jobs that we want to attract here, and those people who are making decisions about where they're going to put those jobs aren't necessarily deciding, I'm going to go to London or Milton Keynes. They might be deciding, I'm going to go to London or I'm going to go to Frankfurt. So it's an economic issue more so than a transport issue. So from the transport point of view, we've been trying to say, what if, what does the transport look like? But if the what if is answered by the economy, then we're responding to it.
So from your point of view, there is no limit to the expansion of London because it's good for growth, it's good for the country. You could imagine quite alternative forms of development in Britain which didn't involve this massive hub in London.
You could, and sort of like that's why I know you're perhaps not, but I'm a supporter of HS2 in the sense that like HS2 links the rest of the world to London and London to the rest of the world. So there's more opportunities for people to work elsewhere, live elsewhere, and interact with London. So for London, having those regional and national connections are just as important as all the connections within London.
David, if I can pick up on Stanley's point, because obviously he was talking about, is it necessarily a good thing? Should we be asking ourselves the basic question of, do we want 11 million people in London? But one of your most striking points in your presentation was that, in fact, the myth that all these the extra population is coming from immigration is that, and a lot of it is coming from indigenous population growth and birth rate. But those two things don't necessarily marry up, because if Michele's saying actually this is competing with Frankfurt, then they are foreign, not indigenous.
The jobs are, yeah. I mean, I'd say a couple of things on this. One is that, there was a time when London, to take Stanley's point, very consciously, politicians locally and nationally managed demand in London, exported population, if you like. I mean, that was obviously very much what was associated with the New Towns programme. And that, that graphic that we saw of a declining population, interestingly, at a time when house building rates were going up in the 60s and 70s, was very much a time when it was seen that London was too dense, that people should go and live out in the new towns. Many would argue, I think including the current mayor, that wasn't necessarily a hugely successful event for London, and that London's decline in the 70s and 80s, and to some extent the 90s, partly reflected that population loss. So I think it's a very difficult thing to do. It's much more difficult now with global markets, and it's not as easy as it once was just to export populations. But I think the second thing to say is that although I think it's quite likely that future mayors, as well as the current mayor, will probably want to continue to support London's growth, it's interesting because if you talk to city leaders in the north, by and large, they're not bothered about London's growth. They don't see London's growth at the expense of the north. But what they would like is they would like a bigger share of infrastructure. They'd like some of the financial freedoms that we were talking about earlier. So I think you're absolutely right that more concern needs to be addressed to how do the big cities outside of London share some of this success and benefit from some of the things they could be doing. But I suspect that trying to manage a decline, managing population growth in London is going to be extremely difficult.
Another question for the panel. Yes, there's a gentleman at the back.
Thanks. Hi, Ed Metcalf, Institute for Sustainability, and my question is mainly for Michele, I think. London used to be the most important port in the world before ships got too large. Now that we've got DP World coming on stream, are there better options for using the Thames? Because it's remarkably quiet compared with many other cities. We could be using much greater short sea shipping, inland waterway routes to bring freight into London and make a significant reduction in congestion and carbon emissions through that. So is this part of the London strategy? Thanks.
It's a good question. It's a relevant question because, as I was saying, unless we do something, whilst we placemake and make sort of London as attractive as possible, then we are putting pressure on the transport networks, on the sort of the vehicle transport networks. And one of the things we either have to do, as I say, create more space or manage the traffic in a different way. One way of managing that traffic is looking at nighttime deliveries. So you're spreading when we use the network, so you're using them 24/7, a bit like we want to use the tube network more 24/7. But in terms of freight and activity, we want to understand how we can get more goods and not just spoil like we've got from Crossrail, but more goods delivered into London. But we've got to identify more wharves that those goods can come into and then readily be sort of distributed around. But it's a piece of work we are doing at present.
Well, I would like to thank our three panellists very, very much. Michele, David and Basil. Thank you.